Welcome to Laibl'S table. Under different circumstances, I miss you all around this table, but under the situation which we have with the virus and the need for social isolation, so this is a pre-recorded session of Laibl'S table. We'll work our way through it. Hopefully next week we'll do a Zoom session together, and that way it'll be interactive. So this may be shorter than normal because I'm not going to have the wonderful opportunity of having you move me and segueing in different directions, which I love, and I'll be highly focused on our subject matter, and we might just be able to finish it off earlier. Nevertheless, let's see how it goes. Tell you a very little secret. I recorded this whole session just a little while ago, but guess what? I lost it. So I'm now re-recording the same session all over again. I hope that I understand it much better than I did before, and therefore you'll be the beneficiary of this session as such. Okay, so let's begin with Chumash, and we're going to look at Parshas Pekudei. We have a double Parsha, and the Pekudei is the second one, and you have received the copies of our sheets for today. We scanned them for you. You would have received it by email. So let's turn to the sheet on Chumash, which begins on what is page 606, 607 at the top. And we're looking at the bottom of the Hebrew, the very last line. And if you don't have the sheets, I'm going to be reading most everything out. So don't be overly fussed and concerned if you couldn't print them up beforehand. So the verse we're going to look at is a very interesting one because there doesn't appear to be any problems with it whatsoever. It says, if you look at the bottom of the Hebrew, V'yaviu es ha-mishkan el Moshe, they brought the Mishkan, the portable temple, the mini temple that was carried with us throughout the period of 40 years in the wilderness. El Moshe, they brought it to Moses. What did they bring? As oil, there's Kolkelov, the tent, and all the instruments and items that were within it. So, what's the problem? So why don't we immediately begin to look at the problems? Turn over to the... stay on the same side, on the same sheet. And if you look at the classic questions in the English side, below half of the page, why was the tabernacle brought to Moshe? Well, of course. Do we have any problem with it? Rashi does. Rashi says, because they were unable to erect it, since Moshe had done no work in the tabernacle, God left the task of erecting it to him. Well, there seems to be two answers there. One, they couldn't erect it. And secondly, God had left the task to him. What's all that about? So let's look. Rashi continues. No person could erect it because of the weight of the beams, for a human does not have the strength to hold them upright, but Moshe was able to erect it. All right, the beams were very, very tall and thick and heavy, and yes, probably impossible for one person to erect it alone, and there was a whole series of beams surrounding the whole area, and therefore the suggestion here is no one could erect it because of the weight of the beams. The beams were, by the way, vertically positioned, not horizontally as such, to form the walls around. So Moshe said to God, how could a human being possibly erect it? So God replied, you work with your hands and it will appear as if you are erecting it, but it will actually go up by itself. So Moshe Rabbeinu, having this brought to him, and how's he going to do it? Hashem says, don't be concerned, it's going to be fine. You just go through the motions. You pretend, and I'll make the beams just go up by themselves. This is the implication of the verse, the tabernacle was set up. Passivity, the passive verb. It was set up by itself. Otherwise, it would have said, and he set it up. So there's an implication here to suggest that something unusual had taken place. And where does Rashi get all this from? Rashi gets this from Midrash Tanchuma. Okay. The Mizrahi, another commentator, brings another version, another rendition of the problem. He says Rashi was troubled why they brought the tabernacle to Moshe in pieces. For generally speaking, a craftsman aims to show his master a finished product. This forced Rashi to conclude that they were unable to assemble it. Well, if I were to take a design construct team to build a home, I don't want them just to build separate items of flooring and carpentry and roofing and then say, right, here it is, now you go ahead. This is just a grand IKEA project. You, the client, that's up to you now to erect it. We expect the people on site to do the whole job. And that's what Mizrahi is saying. He's saying that they brought it to Moshe in pieces. Why did they do that? Why didn't they finish the job? So Rashi has to conclude that they couldn't for some reason. Good. Let's look at further questions. If you turn over to the next sheet, the classic questions continue. The Be'er Basadeh, this is on page 608, the Be'er Basadeh says, even though one person could not lift the beams, surely a few people together would have been able to do so. I'm astonished that none of the commentators addresses this obvious question. Can you hear the clock? Okay. So he says, what's the big deal? Of course they could finish the project. Just because one person alone can't lift the beams. Hey, 600,000 families in the wilderness. Surely we get a few people together and they can lift the beams together. What's going on here? He continues, perhaps we could answer, albeit somewhat tenuously, that in order for the beams to stand upright, the central supporting bar needs to be inserted. And since this supporting bar required a miracle to be put in place for bent around corners, they were unable to erect the walls. What's he saying here? He's saying that part of the construction of the walls, what kept the beams together without falling over? What kept them in place? So he says on the outside of the beams, there was, in fact, a positioning for a pole to go through the center of all of them, the central pole, and that would hold the beams in place, except that this central pole had to be one pole that went around corners so that it went through all three sides of the tabernacle. Now think about it, logically. How do you get one pole, and it has to be one pole, all the way around? How do you get that one pole to turn around the corner by itself? How can you even begin to insert it? Think. You can't do it. It requires a miracle. And that's what he's saying here. He's saying since this particular bar to hold it together required a miracle, they couldn't do it. Job couldn't be completed. And one more commentator, Nachlas Yaakov, says, the Talmud states that Moshe was 10 amos, that's 15 feet tall. That's quite a decent height, a good basketball player, I would reckon. That 15 feet, what is that, 5 meters or thereabouts? At such a height, it would have been possible to erect beams without need for a miracle. If you're that tall, you're that strong, you could do it alone. The fact that Rashi says that a miracle was required here suggests that he rejects the idea that Moshe was exceptionally tall. Otherwise, there wouldn't have been a problem. Since there is a problem, it means Moshe wasn't that tall, according to Nachlas Yaakov, deducing from Rashi, because Rashi doesn't bring that issue whatsoever. Okay, so we've got all these very, very interesting things. Why did they bring it to Moshe Rabbeinu in the first place? Why didn't they finish the job? What was the nature of the problem that they had to bring it to him, etc.? Why did Moshe end up having to do it? And was Moshe this tall guy who could have played such a great game of basketball? Let's go back to the previous sheet and now look at how the Rebbe understands Rashi. Now remember, when we're learning these little sections here, this isn't the full text of the Rebbe's analysis. That's in rather lengthy discourses which are printed. what we have here is tiny, tiny extracts or summary of extracts that helps us understand what the gist of the analysis is all about. Okay. Toras Menachem. Problems with Mizrahi, one of the commentators. The Mizrahi explains that the craftsmen brought the tabernacle's components to Moshe since they had difficulty assembling them. Okay, that's why they bring it all over to Moses. However, this is problematic. Since the craftsmen took no action on their own initiative, they weren't allowed to, as they followed Moshe's commands loyally. Since we don't find that Moshe told them to erect the temple, we can presume that they would not have done so without his prior instruction. Where's the difficulty? He either told them or didn't tell them to do so. They didn't take any initiative on their own, and therefore they brought it to Moshe Rabbeinu. So the problem with Rashi is as follows, the Rebbe points out. Point A. If collectively the craftsmen were unable to erect the tabernacle because it was too heavy, why did they imagine that Moshe would be able to do so alone? Put aside that he may have been 15 feet tall. We'll handle that later on. If they can't do it, why do they bring it to him to do it? B. What was the need to bring the tabernacle to Moshe? Why didn't they not just go and ask him what to do? Why do you have to bring all the elements, and there's lots of them, lots of elements of the Mishkan, and they took it all and brought it over to him? If you've got a problem on site, right, you go to the office of the foreman or the builder's office and you have it solved. And if you still have a problem, all right, you drive over to the client and discuss the problem with him. But do you bring the site over to him? Certainly not. Thirdly, C. Why does Rashi cite his source here, the Midrash of Rabbi Tanchuma? Usually he doesn't cite sources. Unusually, Rashi cites the source here for his comment, which is unusual. There's a hint here of what may be going on, and we'll explore it. And finally, D. If they were able to bring all the parts to Moshe Rabbeinu, that means they could lift the beams. If so, why were they unable to erect them? In other words, come on, you've got a problem lifting the beams, and therefore you do manage to carry them over to Moshe Rabbeinu. Something makes no sense whatsoever here. So let's go into the explanation. After all, the components of the tabernacle were made. Fine, completed. That's after they were completed. The craftsmen decided, we'll assemble it. That was our brief. We carry out the project. We've signed out on a contract on it. Even though they had not heard directly from Moshe that they were required to erect the tabernacle, they presumed, next sheet, that this was logically included in the requirements to make it. Come on, when you sign a contract for builders to build a home, you don't say to the people, before you actually put the components together, we'll sign a separate contract. The contract is finished product. However, when they came to erect the beams, they were faced with the following problem. All the commands that were given to Moshe to the Jewish people concerning the construction of the tabernacle were addressed in the singular. In fact, even the contribution of materials was phrased in the singular. Every person whose heart inspires him to generosity should bring. In other words, the instruction was one. Therefore, it seems from this that the Jewish people understood that every act of construction of the tabernacle must be carried out by one single individual. For otherwise, the command would have been phrased in the collective plural. Doesn't say it in collective plural. It says singular. This presented a problem, since no individual was able to erect the beam single-handedly. As Rashi stresses, no person could erect it because of the weight of the beams. So we have a problem here. The holy instructions are to one person to erect it. Okay, which of the building team is going to erect it? You? Can you lift the beams? No. Can you lift the beams? No. But even the two primary designers and architects on the job, Bezalel and Oholiab was still unable to lift the beam as such. They were convinced, however, that Moshe would be able to erect the tabernacle. That's why they brought it to him. So why were they convinced that he could do it? So there are reasons given. Let's look at the two reasons, looking at the other side of the page 609. A, Moshe had erected his own tent of meeting outside the camp, which could be described as a miniature form of the tabernacle, since the divine presence dwelt there. In other words, Moshe Rabbeinu, during this whole period of having such a close proximity spiritually to Hashem, removed himself from the people. There are various reasons of purity and otherwise why he did so. And he had to build for himself a dwelling which was like a mini Mishkan, was like a mini tabernacle. And since he had already done that, therefore the craftsman reasoned, if Moshe can erect his own tabernacle, he'll probably be able to erect ours too. So here we have the first reason why they brought it to Moshe Rabbeinu, because they assumed that somehow or other Moshe knew the secret of how to put it together, and he was one person. B, the failure to erect the Mishkan, the tabernacle, had appeared superficially to be a physical problem, too heavy. But the craftsman, I hope it's recording because I appear to be frozen on screen, which is not a good sign. I'll go back and check this. Sorry for the pause. I'll finish this section and then I'll go back and check it. So the failure to erect the tabernacle had appeared superficially to be a physical problem, but the craftsman feared that it was due to a spiritual deficiency. Even though, generally speaking, God had forgiven them for making the golden calf, perhaps they had not been completely exonerated, and that is why they had been unable to erect the tabernacle. Moshe, however, did not participate in the sin, and therefore he would not be affected by this problem. They also feared they had erred in presuming that they should erect the tabernacle in the first place. So here it is. They were actually thinking much more profoundly. They were concerned by the spiritual implications of what was taking place. And they were concerned that perhaps they weren't worthy of erecting it. They had been involved in the sin of the golden calf, being present. Moshe Rabbeinu had not. And they thought that their spiritual failure at that time might make them disqualified from being able to erect such a holy item as the Mishkan as such. Therefore, they brought it to Moshe Rabbeinu, thinking that Moshe Rabbeinu, because he wasn't involved in the golden calf, that he would be able to, because of his state of purity, to be able to do so. So this was a second reason that they utilized. However, carrying the tabernacle to him did not pose a problem, as they were allowed to carry it collectively. They were only forbidden to erect it together. So here's another little interesting thing. We raised the question before, how could they carry it to him if they couldn't lift it by themselves? So the short answer is, yeah, one person couldn't lift it. To bring it over to him, for him to erect it, you don't have to have one person. You can have many people just carrying it out for that purpose. In truth, however, this entire state of affairs had come about for one reason only, because God wanted Moshe to participate in the construction of the tabernacle. That is, Rashi's teaching us that there was no spiritual deficiency on the part of the Jewish people, and they had not been presumptuous in attempting to construct the temple. Rather, the entire scenario had been orchestrated by God to give Moshe a role in the construction. In other words, this was all part of a grander design. The grander design was why it was only one person who could do so, and that no one therefore could lift it and erect it, etc., on site, was because Moshe Rabbeinu would have the privilege of being the one who constructs the temple as such. And therefore, under those circumstances, it was Hashgacha Pratis, divine providence, that allowed this to take place. So here we have the other reasoning that takes place. It was all for the sake of Moshe Rabbeinu. And finally, the question of how tall was Moshe Rabbeinu. So the Talmud states that Moshe was 10 cubits, 15 feet. However, Rashi seems to have rejected this assertion, as he writes that a miracle was required for Moshe to erect the beams. If Moshe had been 10 cubits tall, he would surely have been able to hold up the beams that were no taller than himself. Okay, so clearly Rashi doesn't say, rejects the idea that he was 10 cubits tall. Because if that were the case, Rashi would have obviously mentioned it. And if he was that height, great basketball player, would have been signed up immediately by many a team, he surely would have had the strength at the same time to also be able to hold up the beam alone. Since Rashi doesn't mention it, it means Rashi rejects this idea. And therefore, we can conclude that at the literal level of Torah interpretation, Moshe was not 10 cubits tall at all. To indicate clearly that he rejects this idea, Rashi cites the source, where usually he doesn't cite his sources. And he says the Midrash of Rabbi Tanchuma and not the Talmud. It's the Talmud that says that he was, in fact, of that height. Rashi doesn't refer to that Talmudic idea that's brought. And he quotes Midrash Tanchuma, where this idea doesn't appear at all. So Rashi rejects the notion that Moshe was 10 cubits tall for two reasons. A, there doesn't seem to be any indication of this fact in the Torah as such. Nowhere can you find such a statement. And if it were true, at the literal level, one would presume that it would have been somewhere noted as such. It isn't. And secondly, in Parashat Shemos, after Tzipporah and her sisters met Moshe Rabbeinu at the well, they reported to the father the following: an Egyptian man rescued us from the hands of the shepherds, and he drew water for us, and he watered the flock. You remember back then, when Moshe Rabbeinu was still in the court of Pharaoh, and Pharaoh was out to get him, because Moshe was identifying with his Jewish brethren, and he in fact kills an Egyptian who attempts to inflict pain on Jewish officers as they were appointed, and therefore he has to run away. And he runs away to Midian, and there in Midian, as he's approaching a particular area, he sees that some damsels are in distress because some of the male shepherds' colleagues were refusing to allow them to collect water, and therefore under those circumstances he intervenes and gets the water for them. They take him to his home, and then as a consequence of that, the father says, "Who is it that was able to help you?" And they say, "Oh, some Egyptian guy." So he says, "Go and get him, let's feed him. I mean, he did you a tova, he did you a good service." Now, continue the text. If Moshe were 10 cubits tall, his most remarkable identifying feature would not have been that he was, some Egyptian man, a quality he shared with many hundreds of thousands of other Egyptians. Rather, they would have said, "A giant man rescued us." It doesn't say that at all. This proves that at the literal level, Moshe was not 10 cubits tall, and Rashi opted for the Midrash Tanchuma that Moshe erected the temple miraculously. As we said earlier, Hashem told Moshe Rabbeinu, "Go through the motions, I'll do the rest for you." And so it was. There's a nice little last word, little box here, which I think is worthwhile looking at. Moshe already had his own personal tabernacle. Remember, the tent of meeting, which was outside the camp. It was his home. Therefore, he did not need to be involved in constructing the primary tabernacle, which was for the divine presence to dwell in amongst the Jewish people. Nevertheless, God told Moshe that he should be involved, and he gave him the task of erecting it. All right, so he didn't need it for himself, and yet God gives him the task of erecting it. What does this teach us? It teaches us that a person cannot only busy himself with his own spiritual development and Torah study. I've got my home, I've got my place. Why do I have to get involved with the others? He needs also to be involved in helping others, just like God, who wanted Moshe to be involved in the primary Mishkan, the main Mishkan, just like a spiritual leader and mentor always has to do. And with his own hands. You have to be there, if you're a leader, at the coalface with everybody else and helping and assisting. You can't just go into your own home and say, the virus will be over in 3-4 months and I'll protect myself. You've got to get out there and help. We'll talk about that a little bit later on. Okay, so that's our little section for Chumash. And we will now proceed to our next part of our class. It was a bit longer today. And the reason why the Chumash was a bit longer today is because the next part of our class, the Pirkei Avot, is much shorter than usual. So I'm compensating. So open up the sheet on Pirkei Avot, chapter 3, and it is Mishnah Chet, and that particular Mishnah, Mishnah Chet, is beginning with a very interesting, so short two-line Mishnah, continuing from last week, and it is a matter of being able to interpret what is being said here. Let's look at it. Let's look at the text. So you will find it, page 28, I think your sheet is, and Gimel at the top, chapter Gimel, and the Mishnah is Mishnah Chet, the very first Mishnah on the page. Rabbi Elazar ish bar Torsa Omer. Rabbi Elazar, who was living in a place called Bar Torsa, it's obviously an Aramaic name of a place, says, Tein loi mishaloi, give him what's his. Well, if you were just to have that particular reference there, then you would probably say what that means is if you found something that belongs to someone else, give it to them. Don't be tempted to hold on to it, etc. He goes on and says, Sha'ata v'shelcha shaloi, because you and what's yours is his. This complicates it. Clearly what we said earlier, give him what's his, being simplistically, if you find something that belongs to someone, give it to them, can't be that, because the next phrase says, you and what's yours are his. That can't be the way we understood it. V'chein b'David ha'omer, and so concerning King David it says, Ki mimcha hakol, David HaMelech says, from you everything exists. Umiyadcha nasanu lach, and from your hand is it given to you. All right, now we have to look at this rather tricky little piece and understand it very differently. And I think you can guess what it's saying. It's saying, what Rabbi Elazar is saying, Tein lo mishaloi, give him what's his. Give God what is truly his. And what's his? Everything. You and I are mere custodians, guardians of creation. We're the gardeners of the garden. But we don't own it. We don't have the title rights to it. The title rights to it are God's. God owns everything. So when it says give him what's his, now we understand it means to give God what is his. But what is it referring to? So here we understand that since everything belongs to God, and God has given everything to us as guardians, but there are rules in the contract. There are clauses. If you remember, one of the clauses says, for example, you must give Meiser. You have to give 1/10 of your income to charitable purposes, tzedakah. And it's not just 1/10. You can give up to 1/5, in fact, we're told. 1/10 is the minimum. And you have to do your accounts very, very carefully, whether you do it weekly, whether you do it monthly, preferably, rather than try to do it annually, which makes it that much harder. And also people have to wait a long time for the benefit of your tzedakah. Of course, let me add very quickly that you can give even more than 1/5 under the circumstances that you want to give tzedakah because you did something wrong. You did an aveira. You committed a sin. You know what a sin is. I've said it to you many times. Sin, S-I-N, self-inflicted nonsense. So since you were being nonsensical, foolish, the way to make up for that is many obvious ways of correcting it. But one of the important aspects of that is to give tzedakah. That goes beyond the 1/10 or the 1/5. Give him what is his. In other words, make sure that your psychology of ownership is such that you recognize it's not you who owns it. Hashem says, it's mine, but I only want from you the following rental rate. The rental rate is 10% up to 20%. That's one example of give him what's his. And it says, She'at of Shelcha Shaloi, because you and what's yours is his, even you belong to Hashem. Every aspect of creation is a product of Hashem's life force, breathing life into the universe. It is all Hashem. Don't think of yourself as an independent entity as such. You belong to Hashem. What you have belongs to Hashem. It's only by Hashem's provision of rights of your use that you're using creation. And if Hashem says the cost of that is Meiser, better play ball. You're not the owner. And that's what King David is saying. Kimimcha kol, everything is coming from you. Nothing really exists without you. And it's your hand that everything is being given to us. And especially at this particular point where we are in challenging times of the coronavirus, what we've seen, unfortunately, is not the expression of this piece of wisdom teaching. We've seen people in panic mode, emptying shelves of supermarkets, laden to the top. It's all about me. As long as I can be able to save myself, well, everyone else will suffer. It's not yours. You have the opportunity right now to do the right thing of sharing it with everybody else. Don't worry. There will be enough. Guaranteed, Hashem says. We can't see it. The government is not necessarily doing its job well to ensure that there is provisions of goods and services as there should be. That will be corrected. That's a problem that they face, and perhaps they're at fault, whatever might be the case. But Hashem says, the whole place is mine. I'll make sure that it's there. And that's where you and I have to have our emunah. The virus will pass. We have to think positively. Why? Because by nature, outcomes are positive. Even for those people who are most susceptible, the statistic, even in Italy, was somewhere up to between 10 and 15% mortality rate. That's horrific. That's terrible. But let's not forget, it means that 85 to 90% of people are going to survive. And if that's the exceptional, those who are susceptible because of lung conditions or their age has made them susceptible, the average, however, the people of mean age of, I think 48 is the mean age, the rate, generally speaking, throughout most of the Western countries is somewhere in the region of 5%. Children, fraction of 1%. That means 95% survival. Now, I'm not for one moment diminishing the enormity of the challenge or making light of deaths that are going to be taking place and are taking place. But I am saying, be reasonable. Use your head. 95% success rate in terms of overcoming the virus is high. Of course you'll be there. Share with others. Don't go out of the way and be panic-stricken by media-driven messages of gloom and doom and dystopian notions, etc. Hashem will take care of everything. Mark my words. This too will pass. And then you look back and ask yourself, how did I behave? What was my posture? Was I able to follow the blueprint of the Torah as such? Was I a sharing individual? Did I give my 10% and 20% and these times perhaps even more? Was I being able to care about the next person at the same time? As at Spirit Grow, we've become a place where we're collecting from different suppliers goods and services and distributing them to the people who are elderly, infirm, susceptible, etc. Those who can't elbow their way through supermarkets at 7 o'clock in the morning, etc., to find empty shelves on top of it. So we're trying to do our bit. If you happen to know, by the way, suppliers or sources where we can get essentials, we've got a whole contribution of toilet paper the other day. Wonderful. Distributing to people in need. Whatever it is, let us know so we can help. But you, in your own way, follow the Mishnah. Tein lo mishaloi. Give him what belongs to him. And he says, the way you give me is to share it out. Okay, that's enough for today's Pirkei Avos. And now let's go to the third part of our class, and that will be Tanya. And if we look at the Tanya sheet, let's look at the side that's got the big number 40 at the top. It's chapter 15, which we've begun and we've been studying. And we were looking at a very interesting use of verb and adjectives. Someone who's an oved and someone who has lo avadoi. Oved means a person who is actively involved in spiritual growth, development, overcoming their shortcomings. And the person, lo avadoi, someone who hasn't been involved in that process, is not involved. So we would assume, as the Alter Rebbe says, that the one who is involved actively is the tzaddik, and the one who doesn't bother to get involved and isn't involved is the Rasha, perhaps, because he doesn't wage war against his Yetzer Hara. He gives into the Yetzer Hara constantly, etc. Doesn't try to drive out the enemy from the city of the body and occupy it with positivity, etc. Then he goes on and says, but you know what? The person who actually is involved in active involvement as a worker is not necessarily the dichotomy of the tzaddik and the rasha. It may apply to the Beinoni. That in fact, in the Beinoni, you have a person who's constantly involved, and the tzaddik is the person who's not involved in work on himself. Why? It's done. It's finished. Now the agenda is the rest of society. That's what a tzaddik works with. But on himself or herself, done. Therefore, he isn't an oved. Doesn't have to be. Whereas there's someone who is, doesn't work on himself, but the one who does have to work on himself, maybe we're talking here of the Beinoni. Because the Beinoni is constantly involved in the process through awareness and consciousness of his or her shortcomings, of being able to overcome the enemy, the Yetzer Hara, the Nefesh Bahamis, etc. And that requires hard work as such. And then he said that even within the Beinoni, there are two categories. You've got categories of a Beinoni who doesn't have to work hard at all, and Beinoni has to work hard. So the same dichotomy applies within the category of Beinoni. In what way? If a person, a Beinoni, is someone who by nature is not drawn to the pleasures of life, doesn't have a sensuous nature, food doesn't interest him, involvement in the pleasures of vacationing doesn't interest him, it's not even, as the text says, sexually aroused, then under those circumstances, such a Beinoni doesn't have to work hard at all, if at all. Whereas there are Beinonim or those who seek to be a Beinoni, and that I imagine is for most of us, where these aspects of challenge are constantly assailing us. And we have to be on guard, and we have to be conscious and mindful and be able to fight it at every step in terms of our thoughts, in terms of our words, in terms of our actions and behaviors. We have to live intense, conscious lives to get it right. And that's the Beinoni who has to work hard. So these two notions of working hard and not working hard can apply even within the category of the Beinoni as such. And of course, you have situations that would then require us to think in terms of what is success and what is not success. So turning over the page, and now looking at the page which has got Chaf Aleph at the top left corner. And we've worked our way through, I've summarized for you, all the way down to just over the middle of the page. And in the English, let's pick it up in the second column where it says Tu Shavat. The second is Shavat, words beginning, this will explain. And what we're going to talk today about, the next little section of this chapter, is that what has it been to work? How can you avoid the idea of habituating yourself at a level without growing from that level? In other words, I've worked on myself, and let's use an example. I make a decision and a commitment between 4 and 5:30 every day. I'm going to study Torah, which I happen to do. That's my times. Okay, I do it first day, hard, telephone calls and pings from the computer, emails. Second day, I manage. Third day. By the second week and third week, fine. It's working. It's going. I've had the strength of commitment. I do it. Third month, fourth month, it's become second nature. Is it any longer a battle then? Can I be described as an oved? Can I be described as someone who's actively, mindfully involved in the process of growing more and more, because growth is infinite? Or have I habituated myself with a sense of self-satisfaction? I'm carrying out my commitment, and therefore under those circumstances, I'm happy with myself. The Alter Rebbe says, no. You can't be happy after having habituated yourself. And this is the way that the Alter Rebbe puts it. And maybe somebody who by nature isn't a scholar, someone who doesn't have the Sitzfleisch to sit. Sitzfleisch means to have the, how do you translate that? Sitting power, to be able to sit through and study in his nature. But but has habituated himself to study with great intensity, and such habituation, commitment, keeping the time, say in the example I gave, 4 to 5:30 study, such a person, to be able to maintain the commitment once it has become second nature, only has to call on what we call, and we've come across this before, Ava Mesoteres, the hidden love for God which is within each Jewish soul. And that just requires us to call on that residual power of that Ava Mesoteres to keep us going, to fuel our commitment for the everyday between 4 and 5:30, so to speak. But to be able to go beyond the habituation, now that requires extra effort. In other words, the test of growth is not that you stay at a plateau. You may want to reach a plateau and practice that plateau, but you need to aspire to go higher. And the example he brings here is from the Gemara. We'll see. Mashakasu b'Gemara, the Oved Elokim, Haunamish Shona Perek Me'avad Palmim Be'echad. You know who's the one who really strives? The one who studies, he's learning 101 times. What does that mean? The tradition was, the Talmud tells us, that when you studied something, you went over it and revised it 100 times. Literally 100 times. That was the pattern. 100 times, it should stick. But is that all you need to do to make it stick? Or do you need to go further? And therefore, he says, the one who really is the worker, the one who aspires to higher growth, the one who has to exercise effort beyond the habituation, is the one who studies it 101 times. So you'll say, okay, big deal, one extra time. How much is that compared to the 100? Why does he say 101 times? Why don't you say 200 times? So he goes on and says, someone who just studies it 100 times is someone who has habituated himself. The 101 requires you psychologically to go out of a plateau state. Even the one extra occasion of revising it has an obstacle associated with it to go from the 100 to 101. You're prepared to go 100. Oh, another time I should go over it? That is already a test. And it's also drawn from another example, he says. In those days of the Talmud, 100 times. And the example he gives is Mashal Mishuk, marketplace, the marketplace of taxi services. Shel chamerim sheniskorim le'aser parasei bezuza, for 10 zuzas. Someone who has to, the rate of the taxi driver in those days of the Talmud was, in their camel taxis, was 10 miles, or 10 parases, let's call it 10 miles, 1 zuz. That's the charge. Okay, fair. Anywhere between 0 and 10, you have to pay the same amount, a full zuz. It wasn't like they had a meter on the camel and you just went progressively. No, you took the taxi, flat rate, 10 zuz. Whether you go half of the distance or the full distance of 10 miles, up to 10 miles. Or le'echad also parasei basre zuzeh. But if you want to go the extra distance beyond the 10, then you have to be charged double, 2 zuzim. Now hold on, I'm not going 10 miles, I want to go 11 miles. It should be proportionate. Why are you charging me double? And that's the point that we're making. Once you go beyond whatever is a set rate, or our previous example, habituation, requires a totally extra effort, which has to be paid for, whether by effort or, in this instance, in money. Because going beyond 10 was beyond their normal route. It appears that during those times, going up to 10 miles was 99% of your business. Someone comes and says, hold on, no, I want to go further. I need to go out there beyond the outskirts of the city, and I need to go 11 miles. Double, cost is double. Why double? I'm only going a little bit further. Double. And that's the situation. So that's a metaphor for our effort that we need to put in. When we become habituated, the amount of effort we have to put in is drawn from the ahava mesoteres, from that reservoir of inner love that we all possess. You don't have to go beyond that. It's there. However, when you need to go beyond that, you have to draw on further koiches. You have to draw on further effort, because psychologically there's a barrier at where you are habituated. To jump out of your habits requires much more effort than proportionately to go a little bit further. That little bit further requires much more effort. So he's extolling actually the virtues of the Beinoni, and he's explaining that a Beinoni has to always be aware that although you can plateau, it's very easy to be able to reach a habit of that plateau. And if you make it a habit, If you don't go up a ladder, that means you're going down the ladder, the way we're looking at it. And therefore, you have to make sure that you're constantly aware and being able to grow and evolve and develop and not plateau at all. So that is our little Tanya class for today. And that is our whole session. I look forward to next week, because I'm hoping by next week you'll have Zoom. What I mean is everyone should try to download Zoom onto their computer or phone, what have you. Not difficult. And then we'll be able to have an interactive class where you'll be able to speak to me during the class, to each other, and pose questions, and we'll have answers amongst each other, and it'll make it that much more interesting. I'm hoping by next week we'll be able to get to that stage. I wish you a good week, and please ensure that you remember the world belongs to Hashem. It will end up good. We have challenges in life, and the way we comport ourselves during these challenges tells us to us who we really are.